Well, hi everyone. I am so excited to take you along with me to the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is kind of my old stomping grounds as I grew up not too far from there for some years. And every time I went to D.C. as a child or as a teenager, my very favorite exhibit, hands down, was the First Lady's Fashion exhibit at the National History Museum. So, I've studied in some of the finest costume museums in the world, especially in London and in Bath. And here in America, you're probably not going to see anywhere the number of gowns they had in Paris or in London, just because we were always a slightly more rustic, a slightly more pioneering country. But that being said, the dresses worn by our First Ladies were absolutely stunning. I also have with me my cup of tea. You guys know I'm very big into my tea, and this one I picked up at the gift shop at the National History Museum. It is a Japanese green tea with cherry blossom flavor, which is perfect for DC because, of course, it's known for its cherry blossom trees. Anyhow, I found the tea online. If you are into tea like I am, I'll leave that linked below. So without further ado, let's go see some dresses. So these first two gowns that we have were both worn by First Lady Dolly Madison. She was very famous for rescuing a lot of White House possessions from the fire during the War of 1812. This first gown here on the left is very Regency era, so think Jane Austen movie. It's late 1810s. It's made from a beautiful silk satin, and it has a lot of hand embroidery, which all embroidery was done by hand at this time. I believe the motifs were butterflies, dragonflies, and flowers. Now, this one was also worn by Dolly Madison in the 1840s, a couple decades after her time in the White House. However, the skirt has been remade for a later decade. Now, this beautiful purple velvet ensemble was worn by Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of Abraham Lincoln. You can see over there on the stand, there's a second bodice, and this was very common for the time period. Just because it required so much fabric to make a skirt, they made bodices and skirts interchangeable. Now, this really beautiful gown was worn by First Lady Julia Grant. The outer fabric supposedly was a gift from the Emperor of China. And here is a really stunning bustle gown worn in 1880 by Lucy Hayes. The 1880s were really the height of Victorian fashion. Her nickname in the press was Lemonade Lucy because she was known for not serving alcohol at the White House. This was worn for a New Year's reception, and just look at all that beaded fringe and the pleating and the tucks. It's absolutely stunning. So here we have another bustle gown. This was worn probably in the early 1890s by Carolyn Harrison. It has gray pearls and steel beads on the skirt, and then this really beautiful overbodice of velvet and the train as well. Just look at how flattering this is. This was an older lady. This was not a young lady wearing this. Back then, they really knew how to make things for feminine figures. Okay, so we need to take a minute and talk about Frances Folsom Cleveland. She was essentially the Princess Diana of her day here in America. She was in her 20s when she married the sitting president, Grover Cleveland. Their wedding created a huge media explosion, and so much so to where they eventually had to move to a house besides the White House. This is one of her dresses here. I wish they still showed her wedding gown, but unfortunately not. These two bodices were also worn by Frances Cleveland, and as you saw with Mary Lincoln's dress, the bodices and the skirts were often made separately for interchanging. And this is a really beautiful sort of robin's egg blue, minty blue-green colored dress worn by Edith Roosevelt. I'm guessing this is very early 1900s. The bodice has been reproduced, but the skirt is original, and it's a really lovely early Edwardian gown. So let's talk about this gorgeous lipstick red dress worn by Mamie Eisenhower in 1957 to a reception at the British Embassy. You can see there's some smocking towards the top to keep all the fullness in place. This was the post-war glamour era when we used as much fabric as we could just because we could afford fabric again. And as was very common for this time period, she chose to have her shoes covered in matching fabric, which is just so cute. Probably something you always save to remember an event. This one was worn by Jacqueline Kennedy. It's a yellow crepe. I was very intrigued to see that there's embroidery underneath the chiffon overlay, so you kind of lose a little bit of the detail. Now, this sort of canary yellow gown was worn by Lady Bird Johnson in 1965 for the inauguration. It has fur trim on the overcoat. This is a lovely suit worn by Nancy Reagan. This was probably 1980. And then here is one of the inaugural ball gowns that Nancy Reagan wore. It's very heavily embroidered. So then here we have a really stunning gown from, I think this was worn in 1989. You see the combination of velvet on the bodice and a silk satin on the skirt. Really stunning, very 1980s. This was worn by First Lady Barbara Bush, and I think there's something very special about this velvet satin combination. Very elegant look. This stunning red gown was worn by First Lady Laura Bush to the first inauguration that her husband had. I love the beading and all the embroidery that they have re-embroidered over the lace. I think it's absolutely stunning, and the flared, slightly trumpet skirt as well. So I've stopped at the year 2001 because I feel like that's kind of a good stopping point. And also I noticed the gowns tend to be not so classy after that. So there were a couple of evening gowns that have been worn in recent years that both had frayed edges on some of the silk trim. They truly do not make them like they used to. It's not just a phrase. Not to say that the gowns worn more recently aren't beautiful or aren't well made. It's just not of the caliber of the things we saw from 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So I showed you the highlights, the things that I would show you if I was taking you on a personal tour of First Lady Gown exhibit. So make sure you are subscribed to my email newsletter. I'll put the link for the sign up in the description box. That way, every time something new comes up on the blog or on YouTube, you'll get a notification right into your email inbox. Thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. And if you enjoyed this video, you might want to head over to the Edelweiss Patterns blog. I wrote this article maybe 12 or 13 years ago, and it has a lot more details and some additional photographs from this same exhibit.